Okay, AP History. This is the Wednesday. This is the Wednesday after it was announced that we're going to be coming back to 4 days of in-person instruction, still having Wednesdays off, and several students still being out at virtual learning. Today, I've got a lecture for you on the Second Great Awakening and reform movements in Unit 4.2. But I just want to address this kind of first before I get into all of that. I know there's a lot of concerns about and excitement about coming back 4 days in person. I just want you guys to know I've got both of those on my plate too. I'm really excited to have classes together and have us in here, and I'm going to do my best to keep us distanced and safe and healthy, and trying to provide a good AP educational experience for you. I also have concerns, and we're going to do everything to the best we can. And for my students who are at home virtually, I want you to know I'm with you and I'm sticking with you. I'm going to continue to record lectures like this on Wednesdays. And, obviously assignments are still going to be on Canvas, and we'll figure out a way to do assessments and essays and tests in that capacity too. I just want you guys to know from me as an educator that I am for you. And I'm trying to give you the best AP educational experience I can, given the circumstances. There's no way that this year's educational experience matches up to other years, and not saying that I'm like this great teacher in other years either, but just know that I'm with you, I'm for you, I'm giving you the best that I can. And if you stick with me, I'm going to take care of you in the end. I'm not promising that everybody's going to get 4.0s and A's or anything like that. But if you can stick with me and work, I'm going to take care of you as far as second chances and retakes and extra credit, even though we're not technically allowed to give extra credit. But I'll find ways to help you. And whatever the AP exam looks like in May, I'm going to make sure that you are as prepared as I can get you for that, so that you can get your ultimate goal of 6 college credit hours and saving money on college. So that's kind of my disclaimer on where we're at on this day, the day after the election, the day after the announcement that we're all coming back. And I want to get that out there for everybody. Okay. Now I'm going to shift into the lecture on Second Great Awakening and reform movements. The rest of this will be largely for the virtual kids. I will go over all the rest of this with the in-person students when we're here on Thursday and Friday. So feel free to watch. If you're an in-person, watch as much of this as you want. If you're a virtual, let's go. Okay, we are in Unit 4.2. So a quick overview of 4.2. This is what's called the Antebellum era. I'm going to shrink this down a little bit now. And it runs over the early part of the 1800s. And in your textbook, it's chapters 14, 15, and 16. If I were to summarize those three chapters, chapter 14 is the economy, the early industrial revolution. Chapter 15 is social change, reform movements, democratic reform movements, and women's rights. And then chapter 16 is kind of our slavery chapter. It goes through the nature of antebellum slavery and the abolition movement. So we've got three chapters here: the economy, early industrial revolution, reform movements, and slavery and abolition. You've done some assignments as far as watching about the early industrial revolution and doing a discussion board. You've got an assignment on women as it relates to that that's due today. And I am recording this lecture here where I'm going to transition us into reform movements. Okay. So here we go. Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening is another one of those religious revivals in American history. The First Great Awakening took place in the 1730s. And it was a response to the declining influence of the Puritan ideology. Puritanism had waned, and there was a revivalism of Protestant religions. Similarly, in the early 1800s, there has been a waning of religious fervor, largely related to the Enlightenment. And we talked a lot about the Enlightenment in Unit 3, But in the late 1700s and early 1800s, many Americans really grasped onto the ideas of science and reason and logic. And as a result, traditional Protestant religious influence maybe dipped a little bit. Don't get crazy about that. Early Americans were still very religious and very Protestant, but there was a little bit of a waning of religious influence because it was being succumbed by the Enlightenment reasoning. The Second Great Awakening, a second revival movement, is a response to that. And that's the first thing to know about the Second Great Awakening is the Second Great Awakening was a response or a reaction to Enlightenment ideals. It takes place roughly in the 1820s and 1830s. So basically 100 years after the First Great Awakening. And it's going to be different. I'm going to give you three differences between the Second Great Awakening and the First Great Awakening. First, the Second Great Awakening is bigger. It's larger, both in number and geography, meaning it's more people are participating, more people are getting hyped up. America's population has grown, and so just naturally, the Second Great Awakening is bigger. It also spreads out over a larger area. We really associate the Second Great Awakening with like upstate New York, something that was called the burned over district. But traveling itinerant preachers took the revival movement all throughout the Midwest into places like Ohio. And so the Second Great Awakening is larger, it's bigger in number and area. A second difference between the Second Great Awakening and the First Great Awakening is it is more diverse, meaning it's going to create more diversity within Protestant religions. We're going to see more denominations, Baptists and Methodists, and divisions within those, different types of Baptists and different types of Protestant sects. It's also going to be more diverse in its participants. Women are going to be active participants in the Second Great Awakening as both as teachers and as pushing forward reforms and ideas. If you remember in the First Great Awakening, we talked about Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. In this Second Great Awakening, a couple names you might want to associate with it are Charles Finney and Peter Cartwright. Charles Finney, Peter Cartwright are traveling evangelists, public speakers that espouse Second Great Awakening ideas, much like those other two, Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, did in the First Great Awakening. But Second Great Awakening is bigger, it's more diverse in terms of participants and the types of denominations that come out of it. The third difference, and this is the big one, between the Second Great Awakening and the First Great Awakening is the Second Great Awakening spawned a series of social reform movements. If you remember the First Great Awakening, as Jonathan Edwards, sinners in the hands of an angry God, kind of the picture of a dangling spider over the fires of hell and saying, you need to convert or come back to God. That idea was still part of the Second Great Awakening. Conversions and converting people to Christianity was part of it. But part of the Second Great Awakening was not just become a Christian, but it was get active in society to make society better. In class, we are going to read or at least look at this secondary source. It's right here. It says Second Great Awakening, secondary source reading. This is a very interesting reading about what's called in church history or in church doctrine, it's called eschatology, the study of end times. And one of the big tenets of the Second Great Awakening was they really believed that the return of Christ, that the second coming of Jesus was soon. And as a result, churchgoers needed to start to perfect or prepare society for what they called the millennium, the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Now, this is for some people, this is like heady stuff. This is bizarre. That's like, I never thought this way. This is like archaic thinking. It gets into like Bible stuff, like the book of Revelation. Some of you, if you've grown up in certain churches, have probably heard some of this before. And if you haven't grown up in a Christian Protestant church, you maybe have never heard any of this. But in the Second Great Awakening, this idea of pursuing the millennium or getting the earth ready for the second coming of Christ was a big idea that got people active to reform society. So 3 differences between the Second Great Awakening and the first. Second Great Awakening is bigger, it's more diverse, and it spawned reform movements of people trying to improve society. In all, these reform movements, whether we believe that the motives behind them are just or not, are going to provide good things for America. There's going to be a series of societal reforms that, eventually will move to end slavery, that will create things like public education. It will give women more rights and opportunities and begin the process of women really championing their right to vote. So reform movements that come out of the Second Great Awakening are going to be really good, even though the Second Great Awakening will eventually wane in influence, and we might have differing opinions on the importance of the religious ideas. The reforms that come are good. All right. I've just got a few minutes left. I want to keep this under 15 minutes. So I want to show you a couple other things on the reform movements that come out of the Second Great Awakening. This is a quick handout. It says Antebellum reform movements. And I wouldn't say this is at 100% an AP level in terms of depth, but it goes through abolition, women's rights, education, temperance, the restrictions on alcohol, care for the less fortunate. These are some short descriptions of reform movements. Our assignment for tomorrow that we're going to be practicing in class is an in-class DBQ. We did this in the previous unit with Jacksonian democracy. We're going to do it here with reform movements. On this assignment, there's a prompt, and it looks like this. And it says, when we scroll down here to the prompt, evaluate the extent to which reform movements in the United States led to an expansion of democratic ideals. And that question there kind of shows you some cause and effect. Second Great Awakening, which is kind of democratic in its nature, it's diverse and participatory, leads to reform movements, which then make America more democratic. So it's like democracy leads to reform, which leads to more democracy. And then, it'll come back around. But here's the prompt. Evaluate the extent to which reform movements led to an expansion of democratic ideals. And there's prompts that deal with different reforms. Abolition, education, temperance, women's rights, etc. I encourage you to do this assignment, wherever that was, here, and get that turned in by Friday. We're going to be doing it in class and practicing through those documents. I'll leave you with this. This is a little acronym for or mnemonic device for antebellum reform movements. I'll type it into Google here. It says a totally wicked elephant made people devour worms. That's like a weird saying that AP history students can memorize. A totally wicked elephant made people devour worms. If you do that and you go to Quizlet, Second Great Awakening, you're going to see them down here. Abolition, temperance, women's suffrage, education, and so forth. So that's just a little something to maybe help you remember all the different ways that the Second Great Awakening led to reform movements. Okay, that's it for me. I hope you guys have a great week. I'll have another lecture recorded today for next week on abolition and different views of antebellum slavery. Virtual students, hang in there. You're doing great. in-person students, I'm excited to see you soon. Thanks.